right. Hello, everybody, and a literally warm welcome today to the Virtual Institute of Public Knowledge at NYU, and the second The Shift episode, which is on the very timely topic of education. Thank you for tuning in. We are absolutely delighted to have you. Also, a special welcome and thank you to our co-sponsors for this new series, the Knight Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, and also Civic Signals. My name is Mona Sloan. I am a sociologist here at NYU, and I work on social inequality in the context of technology, design, and policy. Among a few other hats that I wear at NYU, I very passionately am a fellow with the Institute for Public Knowledge, or IPK, and over the past weeks and months have had the pleasure of developing the shift together with Eli Perzer and Eric Kleinenberg and the team at IPK. Now, The Shift is a new series here at IPK that sets out to explore the social implications of the shifts in public life that we are collectively experiencing at the moment. Rather than offering perhaps unsolicited advice, we want to open up a space for sharing experiences and asking important questions that we need to remember as we rebuild healthier and stronger communities when we resurface. Arundhati Roy recently stated poignantly, quote, "The pandemic is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next." And Alondra Nelson has reminded us that the, quote, "social conditions exposed, exacerbated, and created by the novel coronavirus demand that we substantively rethink our ideas of society." So really, this is what we're after with The Shift. It is getting our head around the question of how can we imagine and materialize a new and more equitable
And this would be an unfortunate but an opportune time to introduce myself. My name is LaRue Lewis McCoy, and I will serve as a moderator today. Unfortunately, technological issues have taken Mona away from us, but she's given us a great framing for The Shift. And today's conversation will be the second in a series in which we take up the question of education in this particular moment and how COVID-19 has shifted our experiences. So today, I am very lucky to have two phenomenal thinkers, doers, and scholars to have a conversation around this topic. The first that I will introduce is Dean Pedro Noguera, who is the newly appointed Emory Stoops and Joyce King Stoops Dean at University of Southern California's Rossier School of Education. He's a sociologist, and Dean Noguera research focuses on the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, as well as by demographic trends in local, regional, and global contexts. Dean Noguera, you have heard his words and read his words in many places, ranging from the New York Times to the Washington Post to the LA Times. And prior to being at USC, we had the pleasure of having him here at NYU. He's also served as faculty at UCLA, as well as UC Berkeley. He's worn many hats over time, having served as a special advisor to the governor of New Mexico on education policy, as well as advised state departments in education in Washington, Oregon, and Nevada. And he served as a trustee in the state of New York from 2009 to 2012. He is a renowned expert, and we are really excited to have him here with us today. He's a member of the National Academy of Education, as well as the Phi Delta Kappa Honor Society. And so I'm really glad to welcome him back for a moment to NYU to share with us today. Our second panelist for today is an equally renowned scholar who's done some really groundbreaking work. Caitlin Zaloom is an anthropologist by training and is an associate professor of social and cultural analysis at New York University. She studies the cultural dimensions of finance, technology, and economic life. Her latest book, which you should absolutely get, read and devour, and then read again, is Indebted: How Families Make College Work at Any Cost. And it explores how the financial pressures of paying for college affect middle-class families. Zaloom is the author of Out of the Pits as well, which is an exploration of traders and technology from Chicago to London, and serves as the editor-in-chief of Public Books, while also serving as a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge. And the third person who will be joining us, and you'll see more of this person in a way than nearly anyone else today, is our very talented illustrator, Gary Zamchik, who is an illustrator and visual chronicler whose screen you'll be seeing throughout the event. He's a former strategic designer in residence at Cornell Tech, an adjunct professor at NYU and Columbia, and he's the founder of Word's Eye, a technology startup. So I am really excited to get started today. The format that we're going to use in general will be a set of prompts that I offer to Kate and to Pedro, and maybe I'll jump in a little bit there. As we move through the conversation, you'll see illustrations that Gary is producing as a result of the conversation. And later on, we'll move into the question and answer period. Importantly, in the Zoom webinar format, we ask that you write your questions in the Q&A section. The Q&A section will allow us to collate your questions and then raise them to be answered by our panelists in today's talk. We welcome your participation in that form. Also, for those who are watching along on YouTube, we welcome you there. So, without much further ado, I'd love to get started. And this question kind of goes to both Kate and Pedro. And I want to start today with higher education. Now, we're months into this COVID pandemic. How do you see higher education's response to COVID? What are some of the things that give you hope and some of the things that actually give you pause?
Why don't you go, Kate?
Okay, I'll take that. Thanks, Pedro, and thank you, Laru. There's so much to give pause that I think I'm going to start actually with the hope instead. And so I will say that higher education has never been so clearly on the minds of politicians and policymakers all over the country. The visibility of higher education as a major policy domain and an issue for both individuals and families is just absolutely center stage right now. And I think that is really, really important, especially because higher education can and has been a kind of background issue. Even within the domain of education studies, higher education can sometimes feel like it is a kind of secondary zone. So right now, I think that the centering of higher education is really, really important.
So this is Pedro, and good to be with you all. So it's ironic that both NYU and USC, the two universities that Kate and I represent, some of the most expensive universities in the country. And I think this period is raising the question, is it worth it? Would you pay the kind of tuition that these universities require for online learning? We'll soon find out with our enrollment numbers. Now, I'm the dean of a school at USC that's been doing online learning actually for several years. So, almost 80% of our classes are offered online. And the amazing thing is people pay for it. They want the education. They want the brand of the degree. So this shift has not been that difficult for us. But I think there are lots of universities, and this is especially true for the second, third tier universities, especially those that are private, that may be in real trouble. And some of those that, especially very tuition dependent, may go out of business because students will decide it's not worth it. So this will have huge ramifications long term. My hope is that it leads to a big adjustment in the cost of higher ed. The higher ed prices, I know Kate's been writing about this, have just gone up and up. It has nothing to do with the cost of the education. It has to do with lots of other things, but it's become unbearable for many families and many students. We all know stories of students who've been saddled with debt for years to come, which means they can't buy a home. They can't do lots of things that you need to do to survive because of the cost of their education. So My hope is that we could do online learning very well, that when we come back, will lead to improvements in teacher learning at the university level, which I think have been very slow to embrace change in how we deliver instruction. But my fear is that we're going to see many universities go out of business. And this has implications for economy, because education is a major employer in our economy. It also has implications for access to higher ed generally.
Mm-hmm. Can I add one thing to what Pedro just said as well? So Pedro just focused really on the world of private universities, especially with the increasing costs. Of course, public universities have been increasing their costs as well, although not nearly as high as some private universities. But one of the I think important things that can come out of this crisis in teaching, which among the best universities will be resolved by getting actually really good at online instruction, or at least that's what I hope. I'm not sure that I, as a professor, am receiving that help right now, but the shift that I would really like to see is a kind of revaluing of the public education systems in the United States that could, in fact, educate more people and do educate the vast majority of higher education students in this country. So I really see this crisis as a kind of opportunity for our states and the federal government together to start to value public higher education in a way that has been, has eluded us, has been undermined in the last quarter century.
That's a great point, Kate. And I think oftentimes when we're thinking about education, particularly higher education, we don't think about public and private, but we're now in this moment of COVID where more and more people are talking about public education at the K-12 level. And I want to ask Pedro for his thoughts on this. I know you've worn a number of hats, both inside and outside of the academy as a teacher and school administrator. What are some of the things that you're hearing today about this moment, at this period, about the choices that we need to make around education? And some of that speaks to the logistics that we live through. But also I want to know, what are the things beyond the basic logistics that schools need to be considering in this moment to make sure that communities of learners are connected and reached in different ways?
So with respect to the choices, as we all know, there's a big pressure coming on schools to reopen. It's ironic because the federal government's putting that pressure, especially Trump administration, but offering no guidance on how to do it. You would say, and clearly the fact that there are going to be different needs in different kinds of communities is not an excuse for not offering guidance, right? As far as how to deal with the threats of infection, so the logistics are not unimportant. They are very important, and that's actually what's leading to many schools deciding they got to do it all online because they're too worried about particularly infecting the adults, because the evidence looks like kids could probably get through this without as many casualties, but the adults would really be at risk. So as we go online, then there are other choices that we made. We know there were millions of kids this spring that could not participate in online learning because they didn't have internet access. We have this huge digital divide, and it corresponds with class, and it corresponds, but it's not just urban, rural areas, which are particularly impacted. A lot of kids in urban areas who don't have internet access at home. On top of that, they don't have screens. So they're using a cell phone, they're using some other device that's not really appropriate for learning. Some districts have gone out of their way to make sure that they've addressed both of those issues. Not everybody has. And the federal government and state governments haven't stepped up to ensure access, basic access to learning is there for all kids. So that's a huge issue. Then there's the question, we know there are certain kids who, because of their needs, for example, kids with learning disabilities, they don't do well online typically. So they're gonna need to be brought back sooner. Younger kids who can't learn to read at home on their own, will probably need to be prioritized. So guidance about how to set those priorities and then how to do it safely would be really helpful. So districts are being left to figure this out on their own. As we can see, it's a constantly shifting scenario because the information we get is constantly changing. So in California, the governor recently announced last Friday that any county where the infection rate is above 5% will have to do online learning. Mm. That was just announced. Who knows what it'll be come in 3 weeks from now, but right now it looks like most of the state will be online.
Wow, that's interesting. I didn't know California had made that directive. And part of the challenge of this moment is that there are so many different people trying to step up and answer questions that should be, there should be clear guidance on that there isn't. And that kind of piecemeal system can be really complicated to deal with. I was recently thinking about how COVID has impacted us in public education, but Kate, you raised the question and the challenge of public education and higher education, and your work and kind of even your thoughts have made me wonder, how has public higher education played a role in our response to coronavirus? How has it actually shaped what we know or what we don't know?
That's such a good question. I think that public education has shaped our response to coronavirus in ways that are not as appreciated as they need to be, especially because so many of our essential workers and our frontline workers have received public higher education. Both at the community college level, the undergraduate level, and the graduate level. I mean, if we're talking about doctors and nurses, if we're talking about respiratory therapists, if we're talking about medical personnel, basically of all kinds, the likelihood, given the percentages that attend public universities, is that those people received a public higher education. Now, they didn't receive that public higher education without debt. In fact, many of them carry huge debts alongside the education that they are now using every day to protect and sustain and heal their fellow citizens. So we're now in this very paradoxical situation, which is that on the one hand, the essential frontline workers are using their educations to participate and to help everyone that they encounter, and yet they're still carrying this debt with them that makes it seem like their education was just for them. It was just, it was just a good that they should have paid for. Now that's a contradiction that we should be looking at very closely, because those doctors and nurses and respiratory therapists are the ones who are completely necessary and who are actually modeling how to be citizens in this world where the virus is everywhere.
Yeah, that's so critical. I was speaking to someone who's a frontline worker in healthcare, and they said, I appreciate people clapping every night, but I really would appreciate loan forgiveness. I really would appreciate if the type of programs that are producing the people who are making sure we stay alive were supported in different ways, and kind of how we sometimes just pass them off as, well, if you want that, then for the rest of your life, you'll be saddled with this debt. And so there's a way in which disposability in different ways operates, right? There are also kind of our essential workers, and even sometimes a lot of our students who are making ends meet by doing things like security, are making ends meet by delivering food, who are in very essential capacities, but don't have the protections that we need. So I really like how you encourage us to kind of think through those dilemmas and look at education as not simply as something that is an individual choice, but something that relates to our public well-being. And so to that point, I'd like to shift now and have us think a little bit about the role of education. We can think about education sometimes as a public good, what it does to serve many of us. We can think of it as a private good, the thing that we individually choose to pursue. Kate, your book, Indebted, lays out an increasingly harsh reality that higher education costs are more and more heaped upon families. And one of the things that you do is you talk about how families make a way. Can you tell us a bit more about how you see higher education having shifted over recent decades? And could you tell us if you think in this moment since COVID, if there's another shift occurring in how we view higher ed?
Yeah. So several decades ago, and especially in places like California and in New York City and Michigan, but also in other areas around the country, higher education was really seen as a public good. Now, it wasn't a public good for everyone, but it was certainly available for people to aspire to without so much concern about what that cost might be. So here in New York City, the City University of New York system was famously free until the 1970s. And in fact, my stepfather, who was a poor kid from the Bronx, from a family that did not already have a lot of education, could aspire to go to the City University of New York, and did without burdening his family, and really without even needing to ask for their support, because they honestly didn't even know how to give it. Even though they might have loved him and supported him, getting him to and through college was not something that was in the realm of possibility for them. Now, the free public university meant that he could see himself moving from high school into this new world where he could become more educated, where he could become the kind of person that he wanted to be, and could, in fact, end up kind of giving back and supporting his community. That's what we want, I think, when we think about public higher education. Education is not only for expanding the possibilities of employment, which is where the kind of usual line of thinking is today, but it's actually about developing a world that we want to live in, and people who have the skills and the expertise and the ability to envision a future where we might want to go. Now that, today, that sounds very pie in the sky, but actually that was not such an unusual way of thinking, and it's one that goes back to the very roots of educational ideals in this country, all the way back to the early 20th century, and to thinkers like John Dewey. So somehow we have lost that, and it was a strategic choice on the part of politicians and policymakers to shift from viewing higher education as a public good to thinking of higher education as something that benefits individuals primarily and should be paid for by them because it would pay off in a better job, which is a very limited way of thinking about it.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's fascinating. I came of age thinking higher education was, even though there was a collective socialization, like you go to college, it was also like it's on you. And I hope that maybe we can make some shifts in this moment to reconsider what it means to have a commitment to a public education that's quality. Not too long ago, I sat in a room with folks from Civic Signals and Institute for Public Knowledge, and we talked about our favorite public things. And we talked about parks, and we talked about all these spaces, but the place that we rarely mentioned were schools. And schools are things that should be part of our beloved community, but they aren't always there.
Yeah, and I would add too that we tend to think of higher education and K through 12 education as being sort of separate things. But actually, there are so many really, really critical continuities between K through 12 and higher education that I think that we need to appreciate more.
Definitely.
Can I join in? Because a couple thoughts. One is that many people point to Western Europe and even Latin America, where they have free universities, public universities, and very good. But I think we should also acknowledge, though, they're in effect subsidizing the wealthiest members of society, because poor people are not from Spain or from England are not getting into those universities. They're subsidizing the privileged, right? So it sounds good, free public education, but for whom, right? The United States actually does a better job in terms of making higher ed accessible to a broader range of classes. Problem is that we don't treat it as a public commodity, as a resource. We treat it as a private one. And so we're saddling kids with debt. But let's also look at in the United States, we have a private system for the wealthy. Most wealthy New Yorkers have their kids in private schools, and they're just wealthy, affluent. Yeah. Public schools serve the poorest kids. And that inequity shapes our society, or at least it mirrors the inequity in our society. And so I would say that we can't fix this piecemeal. If we just try to fix it in terms of higher ed, we're going to find that the problems are still showing up in other forms.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that entirely. I mean, so the one issue about funding higher education, and particularly free public higher education, is always that people who go to, you know, Berkeley and UCLA tend to come from higher income families already. And any kind of subsidy that goes to funding public higher education will also support those people, those families and those students who are likely to become higher income individuals too. However, I think that the way that we organize paying for higher education is that we really need to rely on the system of taxation. So on the one hand, we have we could fund public higher education, but we would also need to raise taxes on the wealthy, right? So if you subsidize the public higher education of wealthy people, but you actually require them to pay through taxes, then that is a system that can actually be used to support lower income citizens and middle class ones as well. But that it doesn't rely on the system of education to solve problems that it simply cannot solve. So one of the ways that I really see the debate about public higher education, there's always someone saying, well, then you're subsidizing wealthy people. But that is not what education is for, right? Education is not for redistribution. The system of taxation is a system for redistribution. So if we just focus on education, we're really taking it out of the bigger picture of social inequality, which is what we need to put it into.
That's fascinating. I hadn't thought about like literally using the language of taxation is how we do redistribution. Earlier this year, we had a very different moment that I was excited about. We had a conversation not only about access to higher education and the question of free higher education, but addressing the debts that people carry, and particularly the racialized debt. So work of folks like Lois Seamster and Tracy McMillan who talk about predatory inclusion, right? The costs that we have experienced, particularly for lower income folks who are minoritized, Black and Latinx, and their ability to pay back. I don't know if we'll return to that moment. I was kind of excited by the possibility of saying, let's talk about what it means to commit to a higher education that's accessible, and also those who have already made that commitment, making sure that their debt does not anchor them and keep them from doing what could actually serve the greater good. I've had, as a former member of the faculty at CUNY, I've had students who have been able to make great choices when they have low amounts of debt, but often I've had students who carry larger amounts of debt not do the thing that would actually serve a greater good around healthcare, around education, around civic action, because they have to literally pay back their debt and feel that if they don't, we won't actually, that they won't actually be able to live a fuller life in this country. So I want to take a second to think about this at a lower level, right? So Pedro, you just recently, I think just last week, released the second edition of a classic text, City Schools and the American Dream, this time with Issa Said. Can you talk to us about, in this moment, what are some of the opportunities that may exist for us to rethink schooling as a public good, rethink what we do with children? How can we dream a little bit in the midst of crisis?
So that's a great question. It's something I've been thinking a lot about. You started the show talking about whether or not the pandemic gives us the opportunity to change some things. And my hope is that it will, but there's obviously no guarantee. No guarantee that we won't just go back to a status quo that was perpetuating these inequities in our schools. So I think to move us in the direction of schools that are more equitable and schools that are better able to respond to the complex needs of kids, we need to think in two directions. We need to think both about how do we create conditions in schools that allow us to foster learning and meet student needs, and how do we develop policies so that that's not just happening in one or two places, but at a larger scale. So we know, and I could personally name several exceptional schools, public, private, charter, that serve a variety of kids. You name, and I mean, including kids in foster care, kids who are homeless, kids who are undocumented. So there are schools now that serve such schools well. The problem is there are very few of them. They're the exceptions. And what we don't know how to do is learn from those schools to make those kinds of opportunities available to the vast majority of kids that need them. And so we have a political problem as well. At this point, unless there's a change in Washington, I don't think we're going to see the kind of leadership we need in Washington to bring about the changes in policies that would allow us to expand these schools. So we're going to have to rely on states. And here we have problems too, because the politics of the nation are mirrored in the states. But we're seeing states like California, for example, is the first state to really adopt an equity-based funding formula for schools. So that means that the schools that serve the most disadvantaged kids actually get more resources. It doesn't level the playing field entirely, because we know that wealthy communities can tax themselves more than they do. And so there's constantly a way in which the playing field continues to be uneven. But we are seeing additional resources, at least we were until the pandemic, going into high-need communities. And that was beginning to generate some progress. But we still haven't found a way to tackle the first problem of getting schools to learn from each other and bringing good practices to scale. And that, I think, is a problem I'm thinking a lot about now as a dean of a school of education, because I think universities have a role to play in supporting schools in doing this kind of work. When you're the principal of a school, you're immersed in the work, you're running a school. It's hard to kind of maintain a vision about where you'd like to go. I think that universities have the luxury of being places where we can think, where we can reflect, where we can do research, and help the practitioners to make changes that would improve those conditions in schools. So I think universities have a role to play here in working with schools to facilitate broader and more far-reaching change.
That's spot on. One of the things that I've been thinking about recently is that even the way that we train our students, whether they're going to be in the classroom teaching, whether they're going to be doing policy analysis, whether they're going to be the ethnographers or the large-scale data analysts of the future, we still often approach education through a deficit lens. You can build a career, you can be trained to figure out who gets less and never interrogate the why. And recently there was a suite of studies that kind of addressed the question of how much can we use the tools that we've used to predict inequality to produce equity, right? And this was a set of studies around the Fragile Families database, and they brought in a slew of researchers and said, use your best tools and try to see if you can use these indicators to get us closer to equity. And they weren't able to do it. And so I often talk to my students about sometimes we're trained to know when a car is broken, but we aren't given the tools to fix it. And if we're not doing both sides in the educational realm, then it becomes very dangerous. We have people who can identify problem after problem, but actually haven't opened up for the possibility of creating solutions. And I hope in this moment that we can get more people dreaming about what a radical reimagination of schools could look like. Because here in New York, we've had the suspension of things like the Regents exam. We also know that these moments of crisis can lift sometimes the things that seem to be very hardcore commitments, right, around testing, but they can also be the end of very good things. So when the financial crisis of 2009 hit, New York State, which had been pouring money into schools that have been historically divested from and were disadvantaged, the state stopped paying on that money. And so as you raise the question, Pedro, in 2020, are we going to see the more progressive taxation policy and the plans that we've seen at a state level come to a halt because people start to hunker down and think that we have to go to austerity? Or do they actually say, wait a second, this may be a time to rethink it. We may have to rethink the Regents exam. We may have to rethink gated admissions. We may have to rethink whether the idea that 98% of our instruction is in person, are there ways to blend instruction outside of crisis that will actually reach our students in different ways? So it's my hope that we will not, just as folks who research this, but as people who are parts of communities, that we can invest in sometimes ideas that are not as well known, right? It's not the magic bullet, but really say, let's take a risk on our kids. Let's take a risk on our communities, because sometimes playing small leads to very small returns. And I sometimes feel our conversations around education become so small and so technocratic that we always answer why it can't work instead of figuring out what does work. And that's one of the things that I appreciate a lot about your work, Pedro, because it's pressed us to look on both sides of that issue.
If I could just add one thing before you turn to Kate. New Zealand, Scotland, and Iceland have adopted what they're calling a wellness or well-being budget, which looks comprehensively at how to support people, right? Looking at healthcare, looking at living wages, looking at the environment. And I would say we should look closely at what these countries are doing. And it's interesting, all three are led by women. And they have really embarked on a wholly different set of priorities, because this pandemic has exposed deep inequities in our society. It's so ironic that the workers we call essential are usually the lowest paid workers in the country. How could you be essential and paid so little? We need to shift the priorities. And that, I think, we could learn a lot from looking abroad at several countries that are doing it better than we are.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. When you bring up questions like wellness, people are like, well, how do you measure that? How does that correlate to test scores? And I'm like, well, if you think test scores are the end all be all of who we are, then the education around education needs to shift. Kate, did you have something to say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that this is a really important direction in the conversation. And I would add to that there are things that have been happening at the state level that we want to continue. I mean, Laura, you mentioned funding efforts in New York State in K through 12s, and even before the crisis hit, New York State put into action a program which theoretically could make college free for families from students from families who make $125,000 or less. Now that program turns out to be a huge mess, but what it does signal is a willingness to start thinking differently. And so the important thing with that New York State program is that it really demonstrated a shift in understanding about what higher education is for, that hopefully is much more continuous with commitments that were also growing in K through 12. So right, and there are some signals that the shift is continuing, like for instance, in the state of Michigan, Governor Whitmer has put forward a proposal to make higher education free for essential workers. And so that would actually support, not only, people who want to advance their degrees, but people who are, say, working as grocery store clerks who want to go get a community college degree that works for them, that's going to allow them to expand. And in Massachusetts, there's now a bill in the legislature to allow or to pay for $10,000 for every essential worker to either pay down debt or to pursue education. So what we need now is a kind of action from people like educators to support these efforts that are on the ground. I think that there are lots of people who are doing what you are imagining, LaRue, that they are thinking these big ideas, and now we need a political tailwind to support the legislators who are really acting on that vision. I think that's kind of where the change is going to come from.
Thank you. And speaking of political tailwinds, I want to shift here. We are in arguably what many historians have called an unprecedented moment, right? With the emergence of COVID, not long after the video of George Floyd in Minneapolis being murdered by the police went viral. And it was this moment where the movement for Black Lives reemerged in a national and international way. It wasn't discontinued when it began in 2014. It was just oftentimes those things kind of simmer beneath the surface. And now we're in a moment where we've seen people who are actively fighting anti-Black racism, who are actively fighting police brutality, who are actively saying we have to rethink the valuation of life. So I would like to talk to you about a term that I think has become wildly popular that I want to get your take on. And this term is anti-racism, right? And so the third segment, and this will be the final segment that we talk to ourselves, and the next portion of the conversation will go to questions and answers. So if you're online, if you're communicating with us via Zoom, drop a question in the Q&A. If you're with us on Twitter, add us. If you're on YouTube, go into those comments and we'll try to pull some of those questions out. So Pedro, as a scholar and an activist, I know that you're familiar with this idea of engaging racism. And we're in a moment now where New York Times bestseller lists are filled with a conversation around anti-racism. And I really want to know from your perspective, what is anti-racist education? What should it look like? And is it really any different than the things that we did when we were doing multicultural training, when we were doing diversity work and inclusion? Could you say a little bit more about that?
So probably one of the books I'm reading this summer is Kindy's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And, you know, I like a lot of what's there because I do think, as opposed to an earlier version of kind of multicultural education, there's a more explicit focus on how racism is manifest and the importance of not simply taking a passive stance towards it, but of actively doing something about it. So I think that's a good development. Now, how that begins to show up in schools is going to be, it'll be interesting to see, because what I think we don't do a very good job of when it comes to schools is how does that show up in a math class where you're teaching math, right? And because it's much more subtle here. And if you don't connect an anti-racist posture to the work that teachers are doing with kids and teaching various subjects and disciplines, then it becomes too abstract. And if it stays in the abstract realm, it has no real bearing on reality. Additionally, now Kindy, I don't want to criticize him for this, but I think that when people hear racism, they still are thinking about explicit bigotry, Klan type, Nazi type behavior. What they're not thinking about is structural racism, right? And structural racism is actually much more profound and has more far-reaching implications even than the kind of hatred we see from the Nazis or the Klan, or police violence from the police. Because structural racism is rooted in the economy. It's rooted in the way our institutions are organized. It's the reason why we have environmental pollution at much higher levels and much higher asthma rates in poor communities than in wealthy communities. And if you don't have a lens for understanding that, then you can't make sense of America. Why is it that every major city in America has what we call a ghetto, right? That is usually Black or Latino and a poor side of town where drugs are sold and there are no supermarkets and there are all kinds of other problems. That is a product of history. And if you don't understand the history, you lapse into a kind of naive thinking, well, maybe if they just had a better education, those people would do better. All the education in the world doesn't eliminate ghettos. Ghettos are a byproduct of capitalism. And we need to understand, and of white supremacy. And we need to understand how those two work together to have produced this phenomena, which incidentally doesn't exist in Canada. Now, I don't want to romanticize Canada because Canadians will remind me they don't have a great record for how they treat people of color, especially Native Americans. But all you have to do is go to Windsor, Ontario. Windsor, Ontario, which is right across the river from Detroit, actually was one of the places where enslaved Africans who escaped went to for refuge. There is a thriving Black community in Windsor, Ontario that, despite the decline of the auto industry, is still stable and prosperous, right across from Detroit, which is a dying American city. Why is Windsor doing so well and Detroit dying? That's a byproduct of the history of racism and ongoing structural racism.
Thank you, Kate.
Yeah. So I would just second everything that Pedro said. I think that one reason that there has been such an efflorescence of the anti-racist movement and kind of anti-racist strategies right now is that COVID makes it impossible not to think about that kind of structural nature of racism that Pedro is discussing. It is so clear that that there is a failure at the systemic level in supporting people's health, and also that the people who we often think of as essential workers are the lowest paid, as you know, as we heard before. There is something that is so clearly wrong there, not at an individual level, not at a cultural level. It's a structural problem. So we clearly have to be thinking about how those conditions are supporting social hierarchies and oppression that we need to address. It also forces us to ask the question: what might support equity and freedom? And I think that's one of the reasons why higher education, and particularly student debt, has been so much on the agenda, because the very people who are doing exactly what they, are supposed to be doing within the framework of the American dream, getting an education, going to college, are the ones who are being punished by the kinds of debts they carry. And of course, those debts don't fall on everyone's shoulders equally. People of color and women carry those debts more than their white male counterparts. So not only does student debt kind of show one of the key structural problems, that education can't ever, be an equalizer in the way that we sometimes fantasize it might be, but it's also one of the ways that that education, the thing that should be most freeing, is in fact tying Americans to systems of racism and oppression that we all need to be fighting against.
Those are two great points. Over the last week or so, I've been talking to more people who have been speaking to me, and particularly parents who are concerned. And this COVID pandemic, folks have started to discuss this phenomenon of pandemic pods, or like learning pods, in which families that have more resources, who have money, are saying, I'm going to educate my kid and my kid's friends with specialized instruction. So we may hire a teacher to come to the house and do a rotating set. And we're going to make sure our kid gets what they need. And they've approached me and they've said, well, I want to be anti-racist. I realize that if I have this money and this, we know that capital is disproportionately accumulated among white Americans in particular in this country. If I have this pod, how about I invite a kid who can't afford it? How about I invite a kid who's Black or Latinx? And this, for a lot of folks, is like, this looks like they're anti-racism. And to Pedro's point, what I often say is that, well, that's wonderful, but that's more akin to charity than equity, right? Addressing racism is not just about individual action, but it's also about institutional action. So what would it mean for someone who was committed to forming a pandemic pod, right? Let's assume for a second they are going to form and they're going to happen. Not just to say, I'm inviting a kid in from a different community, but to go back to the schools that these children are coming from and the communities that they're coming from and saying, what's an infrastructure we can actually build out that addresses equity? What would it mean to leverage that PTA that often finds the ability to fundraise a whole bunch of money that can go in annually to say, wait a second, we actually need that to make sure that if people are doing pods, all kids are getting what they need, and kids who come from backgrounds that have less actually get more. And for me, until you connect the individual and the institutional and move to the structural, what you're doing is kind of tinkering at the edges. You're doing work that may feel good to you on its face, but it doesn't actually do good. Even if we set aside the question of if you are that Black child, if you are that low income child that goes into that often affluent and white space, how you feel, right? I think about Malcolm X's canonical autobiography, and he talks about the mascot. Like, I've been that child, so it gives me pause. But I like the idea that we can have some different conversations now than we've had for some time. I also
can I
sure,
respond to what you just said? Because on the one hand, I totally agree with you, right? That we can't think we could solve a large societal problem simply through individual gestures. At the same time, I think it's a mistake to not acknowledge the importance of those individual actions.
Yeah.
You think about it, because you can say that about everything. Well, we should. What's me going to a protest going to do to stop police brutality? Well, look at how many people across the country have stood up and participated, even in predominantly white towns, and say Black Lives Matter. So individual actions are important. I think that the life of John Lewis really represents that. But to your point, they're not a substitute for collective action, for a good, sound, just public policy. You need both. But I often worry because there are a lot of progressives who will say, well, until capitalism changes, nothing can be done, and therefore nothing is done. That to me is bullshit. And we have to go further and look at ourselves and ask, how are we complicit in the system as it is, and take action to address it to the degree that we can. All of us, to some degree, will be complicit because we live in this country, but the degrees of complicity do matter too.
That's right. And I think it's using the exemplar of John Lewis, it's about individual action, but also connecting it to larger movements and moments, right? You show up to that protest, you raise the question, and then you continue and follow that question and follow the money and see what are the actions you can take, right? Because there's a proverb that many hands make for light work, but sometimes we think, well, just doing one thing, is it enough? I don't know, I'll just do one thing. Well, there may be three things you can do. One may be sufficient, but we have to ask ourselves in these kind of moments, what else can we do? Or else we'll be 5 years down the line, 10 years, 20 years down the line in dealing with the ramifications of that widening gap. Before we turn to Q&A, which we're gonna do, I want Kate to speak a little bit to kind of some of the institutional dimensions of racism. So I think about, as Pedro and you have primed me to, I think about even the very recent declaration that came from Trump around students who were here on particular visas, and the declaration that essentially you must trade your health, you must trade your human rights, and you must physically be in classes in order to maintain status in the US. How do you think, now it is important to note that there was a very public response from folks who were concerned about that, as well as there was a legal suit that was brought to kind of halt that, so that those that guidance to ICE via DHS was removed. But what can that moment tell us about, if we were to look at a crystal ball, some of the challenges that we have, not just around capital, not just around anti-Black racism, but race, xenophobia, immigration, class, and the confluence of those things? I know it's an easy question, Kate.
Right, I can solve this, no problem. But I think that what you're talking about, Luru, is that there is a clear strategy of fragmentation at play that came up particularly around the visa, the Trump administration's attempt to essentially kick students out of higher education and out of the country, whose schools were privileging health and scientific framework and deciding to go online. That is a decision to use COVID as a wedge to increase both anti-Blackness, xenophobia, and just increase vulnerability. And that is the thing that I think that we can really focus on to move to try to move forward. What are the areas where we can produce solidarity, right? So in the face of efforts to heighten vulnerability, what can we do to make sure that people are supporting each other? And I thought that exchange between you and Pedro about kind of melding individual action and structural concern was so important, because there are things to do, especially that bridge even K through 12 and higher education, like trying to ensure access to the internet, which is a very, very basic condition under which students from the age of 4 these days to and through their graduate degrees are all going to need. That is the condition of education. So what can we do to try to make sure that everyone has access to a kind of infrastructure that allows them to participate? And today, that is access to quality, high-speed internet. And so part of me hopes that we can find a way to make claims by exploiting this moment in a way that can not only counteract this heightened vulnerability that the Trump administration is really committed to for students and vulnerable people in general, but that we can think forward to, okay, well, so what are the conditions of equity? And in a very concrete way, there was a concern early in the 20th century that everyone should have a telephone, right? Everyone today should have the internet. And as educators ourselves, I think that is a kind of goal that we could really focus on, not only in a kind of vast structural way, but even at a local school kind of way, that we could try to work toward everyone in our school district having good quality internet that would move us forward.
Great. So we're at the portion of our conversation today where we're going to turn to your questions, and so we have a number that are populating, and I want to throw the first question to Pedro. I have a feeling you've heard this question before. This one is coming from Kathleen Moore. And Kathleen wants to know, what are those exceptional schools that Dr. Nogueira mentions? Can you tell us a little bit more about those?
You got several of them right in New York City. Schools that serve poor kids of color well. So let me think of one. Okay, Medgar Evers High School, all right, right next to not far from the college in Brooklyn. A few years ago, I was visiting Tuscaloosa, Alabama, visiting, it's college town, and all across America, it's ironic that college towns have some of the worst public schools. How could it be that you're right next to a major university, in this case, University of Alabama, bad schools, highly segregated schools in a city that's not segregated? And so I was talking to the teachers there, and I could just tell from their posture, that they weren't buying anything I was saying. So I asked them a question directly. I said, how many of you have ever been to a school where Black children are excelling? And no one raised their hand. So I said, you've never seen Black kids who are succeeding in school? I said, no. I said, do you think it's possible? They said, no. I said, well, I challenge you to come with me to New York and I can take you to some schools where it's happened. And they sent 7 teachers. And I took them to Medgar Evers High School in Brooklyn, and they were blown away by the kids. And what they started to realize that not only were the kids doing well academically, but they were happy and they were thriving. And as I debriefed with them, I said, what's different about your school and theirs? They said, it's the climate and culture they've created in that school. Those kids feel supported. Those kids are challenged. Those kids are encouraged. That's not happening in our school. So I can name many others like that in New York and elsewhere, where you see kids who come from, and I don't want to suggest that having obstacles related to poverty, homelessness, et cetera, aren't significant and make the job of educating kids much more difficult. Obviously it does. Schools can't solve those problems, and being hungry and homeless obviously affects your performance academically. But what we don't do is look at the schools that have found ways to address some of those issues effectively and where kids are able to learn in a safe, supportive environment. Those schools exist. And one of the things I would have really encouraged the current chancellor, Richard Carranza, to have done much more of is to shine the light on those schools and create more of them. We need schools like that in East New York and the South Bronx, because the real problem is there's a shortage of those schools, not only in New York, but throughout the country.
Thank you, thank you. Kate, a question came in from Lucy Oakley, and it speaks to kind of politics in the moment. Lucy says, Berkeley, for example, was a hotbed of radical organizing in the late 60s and early 70s against the Vietnam War, for civil rights, for free speech, against the military-industrial complex. Do you think that was a factor in politicians withdrawing a significant amount of financial support from universities in the 1970s?
So I think that that's a really important observation, and I think that it is documented to be true. And in fact, Ronald Reagan, as the governor of California, saw the radicalism of students in the University of California system as a reason to cut funding for those universities. He was very explicit about that, so that is absolutely true. Now, one thing that I always do want to emphasize, though, is that there are that tradition, that commitment of students, not only from that generation, but all generations, to their own educations, to finding a way, no matter how much their institutions have had their funding cut, to find a way forward, to imagine a different world that we could live in. Like that is essential, and that has continued to exist no matter how much politicians have hacked away at college and university budgets. And so one of the things that I find really hopeful about this, the Black Lives Matter movement and all of the activism that we're seeing right now, is that it is through those activists that we are going to get a recommitment to the kind of public higher education and public education period that we need to see. So certainly in the past, that worked to kind of undercut those institutions, but it's the commitment that will bring it back to.
I add something else about, because I think Berkeley, I don't know if Caitlin, I went to Berkeley for grad school. I was a professor there. I think Caitlin there too, right? So, but there are other factors besides the politics that also drove declining support. When I started at Berkeley in 1981, it was less than $700 a quarter to go there. Okay, it's now over $24,000 a year. There was a shift in political priorities. We started building prisons. California built more prisons than any other state in the country. We are now spending more money on prisons than on higher education. So it's a reflection of priorities. And shifting that again is going to be key to making other money available for education. But when you invest in prisons, prison guards in California are making more than the average teacher. So it's a reflection of priorities.
Yeah, that is a great and harrowing point, right? So I think of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's Golden Gulag, who kind of lays out that trajectory of prison expansion. To a similar point, there's a question from Thomas Parker. He says, how do you see the civil rights movement with Black Lives Matter in particular impacting conversations around resource allocation to school districts that serve Black and Latinx students in urban and underfunded schools as we attempt to address the impact of COVID?
Who's that one for? You go ahead, Kate. I'll go jump in.
Oh, you're muted, Kate.
Oh, I'm muted. I was just going to say, I think that it's absolutely essential to give a boost to the people who are already talking to mayors and legislators who are in charge of those budgets. I think there are really committed people that we need to empower, and one of the things that is so important is that that this movement empowers them. It gives them the grounds to act on, and so I just want to see it. I just want to see it continue, because I mean, like what I've seen, for instance, working with the Massachusetts Teachers Association and the Debt-Free Massachusetts Caucus, is that there is now a kind of thirst within the state legislature there for ways to address the problems that structural racism has created in a way that has never or that hasn't existed to my knowledge or in my lifetime. So I think that it's really just essential.
Let me just add something. One of the things that worries me about this moment, I've been inspired by the breadth of the movement and the sustained activity that we're seeing and the attention that issues of racism get now in the media. I know, all of us know, this is not going to go on indefinitely. And what worries me is that we are focused more on symbolism than on substance, right? So I'm all for taking down Confederate statues. I woke up with a big smile on my face when I saw Black Lives Matter in front of the White House. Wonderful. But if we're not doing something, I'll give you an example. Before I left New York City in 2015, I was on a task force with the mayor's office to try to change Rikers Island, the largest penal institution in the world that is like a torture chamber. The mayor could have done that. He's a progressive mayor, but what did he do? He put us on hold. Meanwhile, they were still keeping juveniles in solitary confinement. Rikers Island should be a mental health facility. It should be a job training facility. It should be helping those people transform their lives. And the mayor could have made that happen, and he didn't. So let's not settle for symbolism and not address the bigger issues that eat away at the soul of this country.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I'm inspired by John Lewis, so I'm sorry. I'm on fire.
Can I add one thing too? I mean, this is I can add the boring refrain. So that budget politics, which so often go under the kind of rubric of just being like too boring to look at, is so very, very important. I mean, and so that if we're going to look beyond the statues, I think that like figuring out where that money comes from, how it can be spent is just it's the blood that this political system operates on. So calls for things like defunding the police are really important for thinking about the possibility that there might be a different way to have community security, right? And I think that connects to what Pedro just said about Rikers Island.
Yeah, and an absolute shout out to Movement for Black Lives, VYP 100, folks who have talked about defunding police and investing in communities. For the first time in a long time, people are actually asking questions about budgets. And I've never been a big budget person, but the ability to kind of type in and say, well, wait, where's that money go? But it also means that we have to continue to be attached to these organizations, continue to be attached to these movements to make sure that folks don't say, yeah, I took away a little here and you have what you need, because our communities are deeply in need. Lucian Baskin asks a wonderful question, which is, what are some of the specific challenges that HBCUs face due to COVID?
Well, HBCUs are going to really, and I was glad to see Netflix give them $150 million, though that's not a lot of money for all those colleges. But they're going to really face, a challenge of survival because, they serve a student population that's already economically fragile, and they're very dependent on tuitions. If they don't get some bailouts from the states or federal government, many of them will go under, and some of them are already on the brink. So I'm very concerned about the future for HBCUs right now.
Yeah. I would just add that HBCUs are a really heterogeneous group of colleges and universities, but what they have in common is that they all educate a population that is already suffering from the effects of structural racism. So yes, they have smaller endowments, if they have an endowment at all, and they have students who do not have the same kinds of home lives that are going to allow them to continue their educations without a break or without an interruption. And so that the needs of the students who attend HBCUs is simply going to be greater, and we need to address that.
Thank you. We have a question from Melina Sherman, who says, tuning in from Brazil, one issue here regarding education and COVID is how we rethink the standardized public school curriculum for hybridized online, offline, and socially distanced school format. To what extent are these questions being asked in the States? And what questions should we be asking about how to rethink the content of education in these troubled times?
I mean, I think those are good questions. I don't think that's happening at a policy level. I think to the degree it's happening in individual schools where, because think about it, if your kids are learning online, who makes them do it, right? If the parents aren't paying attention or don't have the ability to sit at them by the side to make sure they plug in and do the work, if what they're getting from that teacher is not interesting and compelling, a lot of kids will just tune out or not tune in at all. And we saw that in the data. Millions of kids across the country either didn't tune in because they didn't have the means or because they just weren't interested. And so I think that this is not an argument against standards. I actually think you need standards. We need to be clear about what kids are learning so that there's some accountability for the content of what they get. But that doesn't mean that you can't deliver it in an interesting and compelling manner. And hopefully this period of quarantine has given teachers a chance to get better at delivering quality online instruction. And for the educators out there listening, go to the Edutopia website and get lots of great free examples. They're right there.
Awesome. I want to continue on with the questions as we're drawing near. So Beja Kiesada says, can the speakers provide their thoughts on how to structure education for children 5 and younger, especially when you consider the importance of social interaction in the development of young children? Easy questions coming from the audience.
But that's an easy one because Montessori schools have been around for over 100 years. They are excellent. They're rooted, Maria Montessori was a physician, not an educator, but she understood child development. And she understood that if you put children, small children, in a climate, in a setting where you tap into their natural curiosity, kids will become independently motivated learners. And it works. Problem is, when Montessori's education, it started in Italy, in the ghettos of Milan and Rome. When it was imported to the United States, it became almost exclusively available to wealthy kids. So you don't see a whole lot of Montessori schools for poor kids in this country. But we have a model that works, and it certainly works for poor children as well.
Yeah, no, I would agree. As a parent of 2 small children, there's a bit of alchemy in all of it too. Like, figuring out, as Pedro, you said, who's going to do the instructing, who's paying attention where. Turning to another question, I want to make sure we get as many answered as possible. Melanie Oliva says, are there any developing trends in American undergraduate students enrolling in universities in other countries that are more open and have their university classes in person come fall 2020?
So, I wish that we all could get on airplanes and do that. The kind of demographic reality is that most people, most Americans attend colleges and universities relatively close to home. So our experience as professors at NYU or at USC is actually atypical. Most people actually stay relatively close to where they went to high school in order to get a college education. So I would say that it would certainly go against that reality if people were able to jump ship into systems that could handle them. But I do think that the pressure that we all feel to make our educational systems and our health systems work better for us is really, really important. So I think that actually staying local and using that feeling to advance our own local programs is what we need to do.
I would just say I know a few people who've done it, and it's amazing, because I have a friend right now, her son is going to school in Denmark, free education, high quality free education. Now, I have a feeling that if lots of American kids started trying to do that the Europeans and others would say, hey, we can't, we have limits here. But I think rather than seeing that as an escape, we need to ask, why do we as Americans tolerate a system of higher education that is so far out of reach and so expensive and has become unbearable for too many people?
Yeah, no, I think that definitely makes sense. Coming back to that fundamental question of how do we make this education public and accessible and high quality? And we have examples around the globe that do a far better job. So a question that Jazz McCoy has posed is, what suggestions do you have for training our K-12 administrators to create more equitable learning environments and confront racism in schools?
Yes, that one's for me too.
So that one's for you too, but I could jump in, but I mean, I'm here with the master, so why do it?
So, the main thing is you have to give these administrators a chance to see it, right? If they've never seen it, then they probably can't, it's hard for them to envision it's possible. I'll give you an example. I had a principal from a school in Brooklyn a few years back. She just graduated from the Leadership Academy, a corporate academy designed by General Electric to become a principal, as if General Electric knows how to train principals. So she comes to see me and she says, I need help because my kids are having food fights in the lunchroom. They're throwing food at each other every day. I don't know what to do. So I said, well, why are you coming to me? Do I look like a food fight specialist? And she says, well, I'm afraid to go to the superintendent because they'll say, if you can't stop food fights, you shouldn't be a principal. And I said, well, that's probably true. So I said, I can help you. And she said, okay. So I take her to a school a few miles from hers that never had food fights. PS 12, I believe it was, led by Nairi Dixon, who's still there in Brownsville. And what does she find? She finds, not only does she find a school where they don't throw food, she finds a school where kids eat family style. Think about this. In most schools, the school lunch is, first of all, not very good and very short, and it's a big mess. This school, kids eat together. They sit in a circle. One kid brings the entree. One kid brings the salad. They clean up after themselves. Pleasant experience. The new principal's shocked. She looks at me like, wow, this is awesome. She said, I said, well, yeah, now we got to get back to your school so you can figure out how to do it there. What she didn't see is the culture that school had created, where kids are not even thinking about throwing food at each other because they're treated with dignity and respect. So an anti-racist education, if it doesn't do that, teach you how to eat lunch properly, it's a waste of time. Right? If it doesn't teach you how to treat each other with respect and dignity, it's a waste of time. And so one of the things that worries me is that as this this stuff gets trotted out there, we'll miss the most important things, the substance of education, the culture of schools that affirm the dignity in children and that allow children to grow and think and hopefully discover who they are.
Thank you, thank you. We're drawing to a close here. You've answered a ton of questions from myself, from the audience, but I wanted to give each of you a chance to offer some final thoughts to kind of get us back to shifting our view on education in the midst of COVID. I'll give Kate a second to offer some words, and then Pedro, and then we'll be rejoined by Mona Sloan, who we met earlier in today's broadcast. You're on mute, Kate.
Thank you, LaRue. My final thoughts really connect to what Pedro was just saying, which is that we need leadership that has a clear vision about what education is for, what it can do, and how it can do it. I think that is absolutely essential. And so we've talked a lot about public higher education, and in too many states around the country, we now have leadership in public higher education that they're not really from the ranks of educators, and we need to think again about how we can make good public higher education. For instance, I'm thinking actually about Virginia, where public higher education has become a kind of political football, and where even the board that manages the public higher education system there has been kind of stacked with cronies of a state leadership that doesn't even believe in public higher education. What is this? I mean, this is not something that serves us as citizens, as Americans. In fact, it does the absolute opposite. It undermines the authority and the ability to function of one of our key institutions where people are educated and where they can envision a new and more equitable way of living together. And so I think that it's really essential to keep the pressure on the political leadership in both states and at the federal level to bring us back to valuing higher education for what it can do for all of us as a public good.
Thank you, Kate.
I'll just go back to what we started with, which was, is this moment in the world's history, but in the United States history, a teachable moment, a time to reflect, to do things differently. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it's taught us that when you have leaders of the kind we have now in Washington, people will lose their lives. You need to have good science guiding policy. You need to have the public interest, human values guiding what we do. And if we don't elect people who believe in those things, we will continue down this path. I think similarly, this movement for racial justice has exposed the depth of the racism that permeate our society. Real challenges. What are we going to do to begin to create a more just and equitable society? That can't just be the work of schools. That has to be every part of society has to take that on. And you have to realize that even if you think you're a good person, you're still implicated in the perpetuation of these gross inequities and the violence that comes with it.
Great, great. And I'm taking moderator's privilege for one last unscripted question, which is that as we travel away, if you could think of one piece of media, it could be a book, it could be a podcast, it could be a TV show, it could be something you wrote or not. If someone's listening here and they want to think about shifting how they think, could be about education, could be otherwise, anything to offer for them as they travel the road?
Well, I listened to a good podcast yesterday. It's on something called Sounds True, and it was about the experience of a guy who had served 20 years in prison for a crime he hadn't committed, and how he not only he used his time in prison to change his life, and one of the things, he's a white man, he said he became so much more aware of racism, because even though he was brutalized in prison, he said the Black inmates were treated worse. He came out of this experience not dehumanized, but more fully human, more aware than most people on the outside. So I think there's some good, that's one good podcast I turned to. It's good. So that's a good one.
I'll check that out. Kate?
Well, I've been reading a biography of Dorothea Lange, who was a photographer in the Depression. And one of the things, so this is written by a historian named Linda Gordon. It's called Dorothea Lange, A Life Beyond Limits. And one of the reasons this has been so compelling to me is that Dorothea Lange was a photographer of privilege. She was a modernist artist who took photos of the wealthy of San Francisco, took their portraits of their family lives. But then she used the tools that she learned how to develop so finely. She learned how to look at people. And when the Depression hit, right outside her window, she used that skill that she had at seeing to see people in a new way who hadn't had the attention of people like her clients, people like the wealthy of San Francisco. So she used the same tools for photographing men on bread lines. She used those same tools for photographing imprisoned Japanese Americans, as she did for creating the kinds of dignity of wealthy San Franciscans. And I think that using our tools for looking in new ways and to people who we've otherwise not seen before is something that all of us could really use today.
Great. This has been a wonderful conversation. I really want to thank Gary Zamchek, who's also done a wonderful illustration for us. And I want to invite back Mona Sloan, who will help remind us of some of the great programming we have coming up with The Shift, as well as acknowledge the multitude of sponsors who have made this conversation possible. I really want to thank Kate. I really want to thank Pedro for taking time out of your exceptionally busy schedules to help us kind of reshift our thinking and create new possibilities. And so I'll now pass it over to Mona.
Thank you, LaRue.
Thank you so much, LaRue, for this wonderful conversation. Thank you, Kate. Thank you so much, Pedro, for everything. Also, thank you to Team IPK and Gary. Before I close us off with what's next, I just want to underline IPK's commitment to acknowledging that NYU is located on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples, to acknowledging the Lenape community, and to committing to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. I also want to express strong solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and extend deep felt thanks to all the essential workers here in New York and everywhere who keep us all going. A special thank you to our co-sponsors of this new series, the Knight Foundation and the team around Lily Weinberg, the Social Science Research Council and the team around Alondra Nelson, and Civic Signals and the team around Eli Pariser and Neelam Zakaria. We do have more The Shift episodes coming up. The next one will be on art and activism, and the one after that will be on food. Again, thank you so much, everybody, LaRue, Kate, Pedro, and Team IPK. It was such a pleasure to hear you. And Gary, thank you for your wonderful illustrations. And thank you to our attendees, and hopefully see you for the next conversation.